everybody.
Apologies that we're a couple of minutes late, everyone. Good afternoon and thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I just wanted to make you aware that this session is being recorded and a link will be sent out to you at the end. My name is Megan Walker. I'm an associate solicitor in Irwin Mitchell's medical negligence team based in the Newcastle office, and I support a lot of clients after they've suffered a bereavement. This week marks Dying Matters Week, and I am joined today by our two speakers, Jane Woodward from the charity AtaLoss and Gill, who is a former client of mine who now works as a civil celebrant. Thank you to those who've already submitted questions, and if anybody else has any questions throughout the session, please submit these via the Q&A function on your screen and we will answer them at the end. Please include your name and email address, and if we can't get through to your question during the session, we will respond directly afterwards. We will also provide a feedback link at the end of the session and would be grateful if you could take a few minutes to complete this. We are going to run some Slido questions throughout the event, and I encourage you to interact with these. There will be a QR code and you can enter the hashtag #DyingMatters, and it'll be an interactive session, so the answers will come up as we go through them. So to get us started, the first Slido question should be up on your screen now, is would you say you consider you fully understand the impact of bereavement? So if you could scan that QR code and give us your answer, and we'll just give that a couple of minutes for the results to come in. So we're seeing quite a large split of the answer being no, and hopefully today's session will maybe give you a little bit more understanding of what the impact of bereavement is. Our first speaker today is Jane Hayward from the charity AtaLoss, which provides bereavement support nationally to anyone who's suffered a loss. Jane is here to discuss bereavement, grief and compassionate conversations around death and the bereavement experience of patients and those around them. So I will hand you over to Jane.
Thank you. I'm here. I just need my slides. Great. Thank you ever so much, Megan, and thank you very much, Irwin Mitchell, for inviting us to contribute to your webinar during Dying Matters Week. And thank you too for taking the initiative to talk about bereavement. It isn't always the easiest subject for people to talk about, and yet it's so important that we do, especially during this week, which is the theme of which is talking about death. But I'm guessing that you're all here because you want to talk about it. We have nearly 200 people joining us, which is absolutely brilliant. I understand from Irwin Mitchell this is one of the highest attended webinars that they've run, which is fantastic. So I just have to apologise at the start. My colleague Yvonne Tulloch, who was going to do this presentation, she's dealing with a family bereavement herself today, and she does send her apologies and best wishes for this event. But it's my pleasure to step in and tell you a bit about what we do, but also perhaps to challenge your thinking a little about how bereavement affects us and how, with better understanding, we can help others and when they need support. So next slide, please. So we're AtaLoss. We're a nationwide charity providing the UK's bereavement signposting and information service, and we do other things as well. And I'll tell you a bit more about what we do and how we can help you help your beneficiaries a bit later in my presentation. But to start, so that you know, the aim of the charity has always been to create a central place where anyone bereaved can find the support they need at any time. whatever the circumstances and wherever they live. We believe people should be able to access holistic support to deal with whatever bereavement throws at us, and that can be many things. So, for example, the pandemic, it's definitely shone a light on how we deal with bereavement as a nation, and because we were denied them, it reminded us of the importance of some of the rituals we took for granted, which actually helped us to process our grief. And I dare say Gill will be talking a little bit about this in her presentation, such as being with someone when they die or having a funeral. The pandemic also showed us that without these things and without access to timely support, there can be a strong connection between grief and mental ill health. Next slide, please. So there's little doubt that bereavement can be one of the most stressful experiences in life, and yet we aren't routinely offered bereavement support of any kind when somebody dies. Many people aren't aware of the impact of bereavement until it actually happens, so they're often unaware of how much support they need and where to find it. If they turn to their GP, they often get referred to an oversubscribed grief support service and end up sitting on a waiting list for months, which often makes things worse. And meanwhile, we live in a culture that doesn't like to mention or even think about death. Where once someone bereaved could count on the support of their community, death has now been sanitised. We don't wear mourning clothes to tell people we have lost someone. We're just expected to get on with it. And there's an increasing and worrying trend towards unattended funerals because, as is promoted in the TV adverts, the person planning their own funeral, which, by the way, I think is an excellent thing to do, doesn't want their family to go to the trouble and expense of arranging one. But this is to forget that a funeral is not for the deceased, but for the living, a first step in the grieving process that helps everyone come to terms with their loss. Next slide, please. So why is this an issue? Well, clearly, with a better understanding of the full impact of bereavement, we can all ensure bereaved people get the support they need, wherever we encounter them. Indeed, we can get the support we need when it happens to us. So many of you here will be here because you meet bereaved families in your working life, but you also may have lost a family member or a colleague. You'll instinctively be trying to help. But how many of you feel equipped and resourced to do that effectively? And are you aware of the full range of support available and needed? And perhaps the first little poll indicates that you aren't as aware as perhaps you could be. And that's what we're here to help with. So perhaps we'll find out a bit more about this later in the session when we ask a couple of other questions as well. But first, let's look at the impact of bereavement and what help we actually might need. Next slide, please. So bereavement we define as the wider experience of death, the whole package, if you like. Under any circumstances, it can affect every aspect of a person's life. So practically, for example, the huge administrative burden that follows a death, including dealing with a funeral, sometimes dealing with an inquest, closing accounts, sorting the finances, probate, and simply mountains of what we call sadmin. Emotionally, people often feel shock, numbness, intense sadness, guilt, or anger, or any combination of these. Physically, our bodies often react to the trauma, which can affect our appetite, our sleep, and our physical health generally. And psychologically, at such a time, relationally, I missed one out. Relationally, at such a time, relationships can be strained because we all grieve differently. And psychologically, well, we shouldn't be surprised at there being psychological responses because bereavement is a trauma. Suicide bereavement, for example, has been described as grief with the volume turned up. We often experience loneliness, dysphoria, feelings of hopelessness, fear and anxiety, nightmares, and even suicidal thoughts. Because these are all experiences of being bereaved, you'll understand why we're saying we need holistic support. Next slide, please. So before we look at the holistic support that we signpost to, let's consider grief just for a moment. So grief in bereavement is the emotional response to the loss of someone, and in fact it can be to the loss of anything, a job or divorce, for instance. But although it can be extremely painful, it is natural, and it's important we experience it to help us adjust to what we might call the new normal. It needs to be processed and resolved so that it doesn't become a mental health problem. So getting that emotional support is very important. We all grieve differently, so it needs to be timely and appropriate for the individual. So why is it so important? Next slide, please. Grief can cause us to feel confused and overwhelmed, unable to concentrate, sleep, or make decisions. We can become unproductive at work or withdraw from relationships. We might become depressed and physically unwell. We might even develop suicidal thoughts. Grief is not a mental illness, but these are also symptoms of mental illness, and grief can often be disguised as mental ill health. We know this because 65% of the people who are referred to our website come from Mind, the mental health charity helpline. Mind processes their callers and identifies grief as the cause of these symptoms and refers them to us. So many bereaved people will call a helpline or go to their GP thinking they're mentally ill or simply going mad. New slide, please. And of course, some bereavements are particularly traumatic or unexpected, and they can cause significant symptoms. Research has shown that 65% of people bereaved by suicide are at high risk of attempting to take their own life. 8% of them will drop out of work or education. So signposting to support plays a really important role in helping to prevent suicide, but we also need to be aware that anyone who's been bereaved can be at risk if they don't get appropriate support. So just what support do people need when they're bereaved? Next slide, please. Often, grief counselling is the only support that is offered, but as we've seen, bereavement is a very wide experience, affecting many aspects of our life in many ways. So the support needs to be wide-ranging and often long-term. It shouldn't end with the funeral. We're all different, but the fallout from bereavement can go on for months and years, and that SADMIN I referred to doesn't get sorted overnight. So you can see here from this list the breadth of things we might have to deal with in a fairly straightforward bereavement situation if your partner dies, for example. There can be a whole range of complexity if, for instance, there isn't a will, or the death was unnatural, or there are children involved. And of course, whole communities can be involved. We were contacted recently in a situation where 4 young people from the same village were killed in a car accident. This impacted not only on the families who were grieving, but on the schools, the scouts, the sports club, and many others. So it can be a community-wide grief that people are experiencing. Next slide, please. And it's really important that the support is available, but also that it's timely. It's easy to access, lifelong and available, however long ago the bereavement took place. And some people just have triggers years down the road and find that they haven't really resolved their grief. Support needs to be 24/7. We need to give easy access to emergency support helplines and specialists who can help deal with particular instances. It needs to offer choice. We're not all the same. A comprehensive and well-researched range of services for people to choose from that suits all pockets and preferences. And this needs to include specialist support and formal interventions, as well as peer support, community support, and informal support, such as death cafes or bereavement groups. Informal community support is a vital part of the support package bereaved people need, and is often essential in helping them to process their grief. It needs to be available wherever we live or work. And a commitment to quality signposting, such as we offer, means a commitment to supporting bereaved people wherever they are. Someone can die in one area and the bereaved family live in another. Bereavement just doesn't follow boundaries. And yet we find so much signposting by organisations who have a particular geographical responsibility limits the bereavement support just to that area. Next slide, please. And of course, we need to remember that some people need specialist and cultural support. So people have specific needs or sensitivities, for example, people of different faith communities or whose first language is not English need particular type of support. And members of the LGBTQI community or with learning disabilities need support. We try and find everything that we can on these. They're hard to find, but we do find them. Everything should be up to date and reliable. The worst thing is if you go down rabbit holes trying to find information and find that the service is actually has ceased to exist. So quality means having a commitment to keeping information up to date so that users and referrers have confidence to use the service. And there needs to be practical advice and information so that it helps with dealing with all that admin I talked about. Next slide, please. So this is all about holistic support, and this holistic approach to bereavement has helped us to build a fully comprehensive range of support services and information on our website. We've listed nearly 2,000 services of all different types on the website, so it's fairly comprehensive. And in addition, there is information helplines. There's a live counsellor chat called Grief Chat, so people can talk to somebody who's professionally qualified. Online. We have a library of resources that we've built up, and importantly, this offers choice and the complementary help which people often need. Sometimes they need more than one type of support. So it's important that all this is captured in one place. And importantly also, it helps people avoid waiting lists. So if they do go to an organisation that has a waiting list, they can try another organisation. And at the end of the day, we'd like to think that it does help reduce the call on the health service, which is to all our interests. And at the bottom there, just note that our website is available in over 100 languages, so every page can be translated, and that's helpful for lots of people. We did a fair amount of outreach to Ukrainians when they started coming over to this country, some of them very badly traumatized by their experience. That's just one example. So we offer this service to anyone looking for support, from individuals as well as professionals like yourselves who are trying to support people in the process of your day-to-day job. And also employers dealing with people in their team who have experienced a bereavement, and it can affect their work, and having compassionate employers is really important to help people process their grief and learn to live with the bereavement. Next slide, please. Just a little promo for ourselves. Well, I'm proud to tell you that we are award-winning, and for the quality and effectiveness of our national signposting website. We won an award last year, and we just won an award this year too. So that's really brilliant. It just helps to show that we are providing support effectively, I think, and also that people are appreciating the comprehensive nature of the website. Next slide. We also like to think we're pioneering, and I just said I would mention the other things that we do. We are pioneering bereavement supporting communities by training churches to run our own unique programme called the Bereavement Journey, which offers support to anyone of any faith or none who have been bereaved in their community. Churches, because they're present in most communities, that's our focus. And 330 of them so far are running this programme across the UK, which is really exciting, and it's growing all the time. My colleagues also run the programme online 3 times a year, which we started during the pandemic and have continued because it was very popular with, especially with people with young children, and they don't need to get babysitters. And also if they live in rural areas, it makes it more accessible. So we run it 3 times a year and offering support to up to 100 individuals each time. And we use this as a training ground for the church volunteers to run the programme in their own communities. And social prescribers, community workers, funeral directors and GPs are all referring people they know to the courses, which is perhaps a testimony of its value. Thank you. Next slide. I really don't think this is too big a statement. Collaboration is very important if we're to achieve our goal of ensuring everyone knows where to go to find bereavement support. And we want to do this in partnership with organisations so that their beneficiaries get the all-round holistic support they need. And together, we can help improve the health and well-being of the country. As I've shown, getting bereavement support timely and having access to a full range is so helpful to helping people avoid mental ill health. So do ask us about becoming a signposting partner and work with us to ensure everyone gets the timely and appropriate support they need. So thank you. Next slide, please. We've already got a few partners. And they're coming online all the time. So here are, they're turning to us with a commitment to improve the support they give to bereaved people that they encounter. These are a few. We're thrilled that Irwin Mitchell is one of them and has become a corporate partner only this week, so it's hot off the press. And one thing all our partners share with us is the desire for people to have a good life, to take responsibility in whatever way they can to prepare for their own death, and ensure that their families they leave behind is able to comfortably manage the impact of their loss and get the support they will need to help them with their grief. We can help you shape the support you offer to your beneficiaries. So, as I said, please do get in touch. Next slide, please. And I think that's the end. Thank you very much for listening to what I've had to say, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion after Gill has done her presentation.
Thank you so much, Jane. We will put the AtaLoss website into the chat as well so that you can easily access it. It's really interesting to hear exactly what you guys at AtaLoss do and how you can support those who've been bereaved. Our second speaker this afternoon is Gill Atkinson. Gill is a former client of mine who I supported through a medical negligence claim following the sad death of her husband, Derek. Following Derek's death, Gill also became a civil celebrant, and she's here today to talk to us about how we can enable open, honest and sensitive conversations around loss and bereavement. So Gill, I'll pass that over to you.
Thank you, Megan. Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to be here on this important week. I don't come with any slides, I'm afraid. Just me and my experience, so let me tell you some of that. Megan is quite right. I first came to this job, I don't really like to call it a job, but I came to this job after a close personal bereavement. The funeral director sent a celebrant to me because Derek wasn't overly religious, and I had never met a celebrant before, didn't know what a celebrant was. She walked into my house and it was like a light bulb going on. I can remember it vividly. And I thought, I'd really like to do that. I'd really like to find out more about that, which is what I did after I felt able, after I'd done some bereavement counselling with crews, who were amazing. I went to train to be a celebrant, and I have never looked back. I have done it for 5 years now. I have done hundreds of ceremonies, and it never grows old. I absolutely adore what I do, and I adore sitting with bereaved families, listening to the stories they tell. It is absolutely amazing. So that's how I got into it. That's what brought me to it, and that's how I know Megan. I specialise really in the more challenging funeral. I do the more gentle funeral, as I call it, when your granny dies and she's in her 90s and everyone wants to say something about granny, and it's absolutely amazing, and we hear all about her life. I also do infant funerals, young people, unexpected death, suicide, and many of you here listening today very probably deal with the unexpected death in your working day. But are you thinking about your grief? Because we all have it. Jane touched upon it there in her presentation. We will all grieve sometime, whether it's at the funeral, whether it's next month, whether it's the next year. And for me, it took years to properly grieve. But you must, I feel you must sit with your grief. You must acknowledge it. And that is the only way you will learn to live with it, because you do learn to live with grief. You never lose it, but you learn to live with it. Maybe it may be something that you deal with, as I say, on a daily basis, in your job, and it's still grief. It's still grief, and you must really think about it. I have lost count of the times I've met a family at a funeral. They get out of the limousine and it's always, and sadly to say, it's always the men who say to me, I've done all my grieving, Jill. I'll be absolutely fine today. It is what it is. And it's inappropriate for me to tell them that they haven't started yet. Because men don't feel that they can acknowledge that grief, and that's sad, because grief is grief, no matter whether you're a man or a woman, it's still grief. When I go to families who are experiencing infant death and young person's death and unexpected death, that grief is all the more real. And I sit with them until they feel able to think about their grief. I hear some amazing stories, and I love the funny stories, because we can have a laugh at a funeral. There's nothing wrong with having a laugh at a funeral, and it honours the person who's died. So thinking about your grief and thinking about your funeral, have you done that? I often think that I should be thinking about what I want somebody to say at my funeral, but you know, do we do that? So give a little bit of thought to that. Give a little bit of thought to the music that you'd like played, because these things they're hard for people to think about. They're hard for people, your family, to think about after after you've died, when they're trying to plan that funeral. So think about them now, please, and give your family a break. I'm happy to accept any questions about what I do, but it's brought me a peace that I didn't have before, and I just absolutely adore it. I'll hand back to Megan now.
Thank you so much, Jill. Thanks for sharing that with us. I know obviously you've had a deeply personal experience that brought you to this. So I do appreciate you taking the time to discuss that with us. You'll see on your screen now we have another Slido question, which is, have you received training or information to help you support bereaved people in your work? So we'll give you a few minutes to answer that one, and we'll have a little chat around what answer comes through there. We can see those answers coming in, and it seems to be that the majority are saying some, with some saying yes and some saying no. So Jane, is there available information through AtaLoss for people to be able to access who are supporting bereaved people, as well as those who've been bereaved themselves? Is that something that you offer?
Yes, there is some information on the website, but we don't expect everybody to be bereavement or counsellors or grief experts. Sometimes what people need is just somebody to listen, and sometimes they just need information, and the information is there in its abundance on ataloss.org, and that's why we set it up, really. So that is a very easy win for anybody. It also helps you because I'm sure all of you are extremely busy and you'll probably be doing your main job, not providing support to individuals. So at times when it's really busy, it can help you just to know where to go to send people for support and suggest that you can help them find it if they're perhaps not familiar with using a laptop or a computer. But it's all there and easy for them to use. So if they familiarise themselves with it, it should be real help in their work.
Great, thank you, Jane. And I mean, is the response that surprising to you at all, or is that what would you expect in terms of the kind of support and training people get?
Well, to be honest, I'm fairly surprised that people have received some, but then of course I don't know everybody who's attending. So some organisations are better than others, but I think Gill's point is very powerful about making sure that they look after self-care as well, because if you're dealing with traumatic situations, you need to be mindful of your own response to that situation as well. So don't be afraid to get help if you do need it.
Thanks, Jane. And the next slide or question we've got for you there will be coming up on your screen. So that is, do you feel confident signposting bereaved people to support? So again, we'll just give you a couple of minutes to answer that one. So we're seeing a lot of yeses, which is great. Is that what you would have expected, Jane, or?
Well, it's what I would hope for, because if you're not, as I say, if you're not providing bereavement support, you just really need to know where to send people so that they can get it. And as I explained in my presentation, there's an awful lot of different types of support that people need in their bereavement. So we can't be experts on everything. So the key thing is knowing where to go. And I'd like to think they use AtaLoss as well, because that's fairly comprehensive and it covers the whole country. So it can be really helpful.
Yes.
Did we get an answer to the first question? Did we get the percentages to the first question that you asked about whether people know about, they would say they know about bereavement?
I'm not sure. Well, it did come up.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I didn't mean to go back to the. Okay, that is that's probably fairly typical. So don't beat yourself up if you don't feel you do know about it. I think it's really great that we're having a session like this, because I think, you know, these are opportunities to familiarise ourselves with the whole big issue. We wish that more people did know about it, particularly you know, government officials and people making policy decisions, so that it did benefit people who've been bereaved. It tends to be a bit of a minority subject in government policy, and it slips into different departments, but of course it affects every department. Work and pensions, you know, it affects the loneliness strategy which the government is trying to push out. It affects their health as well. So, you know, it really needs to be better understood by people at the top, but as long as we're getting to understand it on the ground so that we can actually help people, that's the important thing. And I hope what we've said today, Gill and I, is helpful in that process.
Thanks, Jane. So we're going to move to some questions now. So if you do have any questions, please do send them through in the Q&A box. The first question we have today is for you, Gill. First off, thank you for sharing. And the question is, who usually contacts you to engage with bereaved families? Is it the family themselves, or is it a third party support who are already accessing a signpost to you?
Both, actually. I get most of my business via a funeral director. They would speak to the family in the first instance, obviously, and discuss whether they would like a celebrant or a religious ceremony. I'm not a humanist. I'm a civil celebrant, which means I sit between a minister and a humanist. Therefore, I'm quite happy to say prayers at a funeral, whereas a humanist would not do that. I also get referral direct from families, which is lovely. It's humbling, to be honest. It's amazing when families will ring me again for another of their family members because I've done a previous funeral, and that's my barometer of whether I'm doing things right. And it's lovely. So both ways, really.
Thanks, Gill. Have we got any more questions from anyone? If you want to just send those through. Okay. And is that something that you also signpost to, Jane, to celebrants on AtaLoss, or is it more of a bereavement support in a different way?
No, we do provide information about civil celebrants, and we provide information. In fact, we posted an article recently which was written by the Chief Executive of SAFE, which is the Independent Funeral Directors Organisation, and he wrote about different types of funerals, so people know. But we do signpost to the civil celebrants' own professional organisation, so people can do a search in their own area and find a suitable celebrant, because we cover the whole country. So we don't tend to do individual celebrants. I'd love Gill to be on there, though. I think it needs to be on there, Gill.
With pleasure.
But I think that's the right route, really, because people are doing a search on one of the filters on our website is to do a search where you live. So if they're looking for a celebrant, it's better to find it in their local area rather than ask Gill, who's up in Newcastle, to go down to Devon or something. That just wouldn't work. So.
And I've got a question here for both of you. So do you find that after COVID, people are more willing to discuss death or not? I guess we'll go to Gill first.
I don't actually think it's made a great deal of difference. During COVID, I did too many funerals. I led far too many funerals for all the people who thought COVID wasn't a thing. I used to think, come and spend a day with me and the funeral director. It was sobering. It really was. It was really bad. So I don't think that COVID has made that much difference. I think in general, people aren't willing to discuss their funerals. They're getting a little better, but in general, I don't think it's made a great deal of difference.
What about you, Jane?
Well, I agree with Gill on that front. I think there was a lot of conversation, angry conversation that went on. People felt very angry, and especially the care home situation, that was tragic. And the two things that emerged from the COVID experience, one was that we found that a lot of younger people were bereaved because they lost their grandparents, and that is something relatively new. So there are people in their late teens, 20s being bereaved is relatively unusual. So there's a lot of different type of grief around. The other thing is, because of the nature of the pandemic, people weren't able to get the support. And I think there was a lot of talk, Gill, you probably know this, there was a lot of talk, well, we can't have a proper funeral, we might have a celebration afterwards. It never happened. And I honestly don't know why it didn't happen, but I think we're still processing that grief that came up in the pandemic, and certainly it has contributed to a mental health crisis in this country. I'm sure that there's a lot of unresolved grief from that period of time, and one of the indicators that we have on our website was that grief chat, which is people can talk online to a professional counsellor using our grief chat service, and that has trebled since 2021-22, and the information from the people who provide that service for us is that a lot of the discussion is about COVID and COVID deaths in that time. So yeah, I don't think people are willing to talk about death. I think they just feel angry. And of course, the inquiry came out of that, and it sort of probably ignited a lot of that anger. But we did have a bereavement commission that met and reported in 2022, and that was supposed to highlight how we deal with bereavement better. And it's a very interesting report. We just need the government, perhaps the next one now, to actually take that report, embrace it and listen to what it says, because a lot of research was done in that post-pandemic period. And there was quite a lot of research about how people were accessing information and finding bereavement support, and they just weren't finding it. So 50%, I think, in one bit of research I found were not finding the support they needed. So sorry, that's not a short answer, but it sort of talks around that subject that, you know, it did have some impact because so many people died, and I think we all know somebody who probably did die. So it did have an enormous impact on the whole country in one way or another.
Thanks, Jane. I do have another question here for you. So is there anything on the AtaLoss website that gives any kind of indication of waiting times for services before somebody is referred to them?
Well, what's really difficult for us is we've got 2,000 services, so actually to keep that information up to date would mean we'd have to work 24/7 and have another 10 people probably, because it does change depending on funding and all sorts of things. What we're trying to do is identify services that are free or paid for, so that information we can provide. But, you know, bereaved people are perfectly able to use the contact details and pick up the phone and speak to people themselves, and they ought to ask, have you got a waiting list? So, you know, if you know somebody, just say, if you're making contact, please ask them if they've got a waiting list, that they don't just automatically sit on a waiting list and don't get that support they need. But no, we can't really keep track of that. It's difficult to know how we would, to be honest. But as I say, we are trying our best to add information into the details of each of those organisations about whether it's free and paid for, and that's one of the things that people do want to know about. So.
Thank you. And I think this was probably a good question for both of you, because Gill, I assume you deal with people kind of not long after someone has passed away, and if someone doesn't know where to start with all of the admin for things like funeral or for other things that need to be dealt with when someone's passed away, where is that best support found? Is there anywhere that either of you recommend? Or I obviously assume it's signposted on AtaLoss, but specifically for that admin help.
I've used it. I've used this actually personally, and I know that a lot of my families use the Tell Me Once government. It's on a government website, and that just you tell them once that someone has died, and then they cover all of your admin, which I'm sure Jane knows all about, and Jane can touch on a little more. But if I may go back just very, very briefly to when we were dealing with COVID and the funerals during COVID, out of that was born a great use of the webinar webcast situation on funerals. And I would ask anyone dealing with, if there's any family liaison people here today, if someone cannot attend a funeral, please ask them to ask their funeral director about the webcasts, because that is an amazing tool. They can sit at home if they're not able to go to a funeral, and they can watch the funeral and be part of it, as most people did during COVID. So that is an amazing thing to take on board.
And so the initial question was about administration and sorting it all out. The Tell Us Once service is fantastic. It does mean that all the official bodies that deal with things like driving licenses and passports, all that sort of thing, is covered. What it doesn't do, of course, is to help you close accounts. And because of the nature of the life we live at the moment, it becomes an impossible task. But there are organisations out there that can help with that, and I'll just need to have a think, because there are a couple. I'll put them in the chat so people can find them. But there are organisations now that specialise in that sort of thing. And also there's an organisation up in the Northwest which is launching this week called Funeral Experts, which is going to help people find a funeral director. Because it is an unregulated business, and I know people have lots of questions about funeral directors. There's been a lot in the press as well. So that will be helpful going forward. And there was also a question here about a podcast. One of the podcasts I think which is really good, is a podcast by Cariad Lloyd, and it's called Griefcast. And it's a podcast that examines the human experience of grief and death. And she's a comedian, so there is a funny side to it as well. So if you Google it, find out where it is and have a listen. I think you'll find that quite enjoyable. It's one of my favourites.
Thanks. We've had a couple of comments in the section as well, which says, it's good to hear what there is outside of the NHS. I guess a lot of our listeners work within the NHS, so it's good for them to see that there are services outside of that can be accessed. And somebody said they want Jill's job. It sounds very amazing and fulfilling. And somebody else has commented on what Jane had to say about the pandemic, saying that they were a nurse during this, and they totally agree about the ongoing psychological impact that has had on people with things like long COVID, but also wrapped up in the grief for those who died during the pandemic. So it shows how much grief is intertwined with our mental health and how long that can go on. Jill, I think you've got something you would like to say as well.
Yes, just when you mentioned NHS there, I do quite a few funerals for infant death, extremely early infant death. And I know that the NHS have this covered in a form where once a month, I think in our area, they do a gathering for parents and do one funeral. And the parents tell me, when they come to me, the parents tell me that they're not being told they can have a funeral, no matter how early the death. And I do very early infant death in a very different way. I sit with the parents. I don't stand at a lectern. I sit with those parents, and we take time. to do what they need to do. And it's very personal and it's very private. And I just wondered, maybe that's not really put over in the NHS. I'm not sure whether it is. Parents are telling me that it's not, and it is free. So I think that's a valuable point to make.
Thanks, Jill. So I think that's all the questions we've got at the minute, but if anybody has any further questions following the session, then please do send those to us and we'll address those. We will be putting, like I said, a feedback link in the chat, so please do take a few minutes to respond and let us know what you thought of today's webinar. I'd like to say thank you so much to both Jill and Jane for joining us today, sharing their experiences and sharing their knowledge in this area. It's something very important that we should all be talking about. And they've both given us, you know, a lot to think about in the way that we can approach these topics. We at Irwin Mitchell have a lot of webinars coming up throughout the year, so please do check our website to see if there's anything else that you would like to sign up to. And we will finish there.
I just put the link in All Settled, which is a really fabulous organisation that can help people close accounts.
Great, thanks so much, Jane, and thank you everybody for joining us today.